give you an example of the power of history, is not history because it's interesting. It's really history with an agenda. And the agenda is, what are the lessons buried in that history that have profound relevance to us today? For example, we act as if the addiction treatment field will live forever now that it's been created. I don't believe that. I believe addiction treatment as a social institution is still very much on probationary status right now in this culture. I believe there have been excesses within the industry that could create a cultural backlash that could very much jeopardize a lot of what we've spent decades creating. So how do I know that? If I go back and look at the history of the inebriate asylums, the inebriate homes, the private addiction cure institutes of the 19th century, if I look at the miracle cures, bottled and boxed cures for addiction and all the frauds that went with them, and say, how did we go from this flourishing network of services that flourished in the 1870s through the turn of the century, and that 15 years later, the vast majority of those would have collapsed and died? Well, there's some things we can learn from them.
William L. White is an emeritus senior research consultant at Chestnut Health Systems, Lighthouse Institute, and past chair of the Board of Recovery Communities United. Bill has worked full-time in the addictions field since 1969 as a counselor, street worker, clinical director, researcher, and well-traveled trainer and consultant. He's authored or co-authored more than 400 articles, monographs, research reports, and book chapters. His book, Slaying the Dragon, The History of Addiction Treatment and Recovery in America, received the McGovern Family Foundation Award for the best book on addiction recovery. William White was featured in the Bill Moyers PBS special, Close to Home, Addiction in America, and Showtime's documentary, Smoking, Drinking, and Drugging in the 20th Century.
I entered this special recovery ministry field in 1969. Like most people in that era entering the addiction treatment field, I came out of a background of personal and family recovery, very typical in the late 1960s, very little recovery time. There wasn't a long line of people waiting to work with addicted people in those years. In fact, there was a lot of professional stigma for those people that chose to do that. The role that I had early on was in Illinois. It was with the Department of Mental Health, and I was really doing two things. One was traveling to state hospitals in the heydays of deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill, screening people with histories of alcoholism and drug addiction for reentry into the community. And then the second part of that role that I had was trying to organize sort of grassroots services in local community for detoxification, for treatment. And so in some ways I kind of overlapped. I saw the remnants of everything that existed before the rise of modern treatment. I saw the drunk tanks and the jails and the penal colonies, and saw the backwards of aging state psychiatric hospitals. I interviewed people who'd been lobotomized as a cure for alcoholism, been exposed to indiscriminate shock therapies, drugged with every kind of imaginable antipsychotic tranquilizing medication, people who had become incredibly institutionalized within the psychiatric system, people who had sort of experienced great harm in the name of help in much of what preceded modern addiction treatment. And at the same time was on the brink of the funding that came through in the early 1970s from NIAAA and NIDA that really laid the local, state, federal partnership that created the basic infrastructure of modern addiction treatment. So it was a very exciting time. That was a product of probably 30 to 40 years of advocacy dating back to Marty Mann's work establishing the National Committee for Education on Alcoholism in 1944. And those advocates spent decades of their lives really bringing us to that 1970-72 kinetic point of the legislation that created modern addiction treatment. Part of what I did in the community at that point in time, I was in a community with virtually no resources at that time. So part of what I did was I became available to the jails and to the emergency rooms on a kind of a 24-hour-a-day basis. So I made daily rounds in the jails, did daily rounds in the ER hospitals and in the psychiatric units, basically screening people and doing everything I could to link them to what few alcoholism services existed in Illinois at that point in time. And that street work, which is what we began to call it, was it kind of grew into, if there are no services, how do we reach these individuals? And it was sort of I remember we used the sort of Willie Sutton metaphor. There was this story of Willie Sutton, the famous bank robber, about, Willie, why do you keep robbing banks? And Willie said, because that's where the money was at. So we said, well, if we're really serious about addiction, let's go where the addiction's at. So the street work program was really sort of penetrating sort of the heart of people with the most severe and complex and chronic addiction problems, and engaging them in an ongoing relationship and linking them to what recovery resources that we could find in those years. And then that work then began to generate advocacy to build the first treatment programs in that part of the state that I was working in. So I would go on and work as a counselor in those programs, went on to become a clinical supervisor, went on to administer programs for a number of years, and that really sort of marked my transition from a community organizer, from a therapist, into probably my most concentrated years of clinical work and clinical supervision. And then in 1978, I went from Central Illinois, moved to Chicago, went to work for the Illinois Dangerous Drugs Commission, and sort of branched into the areas of training this sort of emerging new workforce. Still in the 1970s, mostly people in recovery. And most of the workforce at that period of time in terms of addiction counselors, probably 70–80% of those individuals were in recovery. And the remaining who were not in recovery were sort of renegade professionals from psychology, social work, psychiatry, who were often stigmatized for why on earth would you want to work with those people? But they were the renegades, and we created this sort of motley assortment of people in recovery and these renegade professionals that really was an exciting era of sort of the first generation of addiction treatment. And it was a time of incredible innovation, but it was also a time of some strangeness looking back, because we were really two fields. There was an alcoholism field at that point in time, and there was what was then called the drug abuse field. And with never the twain shall meet. So you had rather bizarre kinds of things as a result of that. For example, you had treatment programs in which treatment for mostly heroin addicts in therapeutic communities. In the second phase, you could earn drinking privileges because nobody had a concept of addiction. There was just a concept of a drug-specific addiction. So there was no question or even a concern, particularly early on, about what's the problem with heroin addicts drinking. Alcohol wasn't their problem. And so it took a period of time before we saw two things. One, we saw people on the alcoholism side beginning to get into trouble with prescribed medications and illicit drugs. And then we began to see people on the drug side developing very severe alcohol problems once they'd actually stopped addiction to other drugs. So there was sort of a synergy that slowly in the 1970s brought those two fields into the modern field of addiction. But there were bloody, horrific battles and arguments and tensions and personal acrimony for the debates that would create this unified field during that period of time. The other thing I got into in the Dangerous Drugs Commission was some of the first research work that I did. And most of that was tracking drug trends, new drug trends that were emerging, beginning some of the first evaluation work that I was involved in with addiction treatment. I went from there to a job with a regional training center for the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And that was sort of my first awakening to what was going on nationally. We had coverage of 10 states to basically do training for frontline addiction counselors, allied health professionals. And that created a bridge for me to get involved with a lot of national work and a lot of national training. So that a couple years later, I relocated to Washington, D.C., did some initial work with the National Drug Abuse Center, and really began to help shape some of the early curriculum used in the training of addiction counselors. Early 1980s, there was a medical crisis. I returned to Illinois and took a job coming back into clinical work directing an inpatient alcoholism treatment program. And that really kind of gave me great insights to the growing proliferation of hospital-based programs and private treatment programs as a backdrop to the public programs I primarily worked in. One of the frustrations that I had in that job was I was trying to convince my hospital to create a department of behavioral medicine that would really do not only the clinical work but also clinical research and training. And they just couldn't quite get that concept. So I was at a conference and ran into a person that I had once hired, who then went on to become executive director of what became Chestnut Health Systems. And I mentioned to him what I was doing at the hospital, and I was having some difficulty convincing the administrators about this whole concept of a hospital involved in research and community and statewide and national training. And so about a week later, he called and he said, "Why don't you come back to work for us, and we'll just create a research division, and you can do that. Just do it. You think you can at least break even after a year or so." So with that kind of contract to do whatever you want but break even and don't embarrass me, we launched what became the research division of Chestnut Health Systems. At the research division, one of the things that we began to do was really evaluate both adolescent and adult addiction treatment. And we found not only the positive effects of those treatments, but we also became acutely aware of the limitations of that treatment in terms of limited capacity to attract people voluntarily into that treatment, high attrition rates, often at the 40-50% level, inadequate completion rates, and most importantly, almost no post-treatment continuing care services to speak of. So we were able to measure the effects short-term, but when we began to do the longer-term studies, part of the sort of awakening we had as researchers at that point was an awareness that we were putting people with incredibly severe, complex, and chronic addiction problems into ever briefer episodes of addiction treatment with treatment that was becoming increasingly diluted down in ways that there was almost no probable prospects of successful long-term recovery. And when in fact that individual was discharged, often from their third, fourth, or fifth treatment, and relapsed, we continued to come back again and blame them and essentially say, that was a personal failure, you didn't do it right. And what we as researchers began to conclude was that was not a personal failure, that was a systems failure. And that what we really needed to do was, rather than continue to blame the victim in this case, we needed to think about a fundamental redesign of addiction treatment. So that was when we began to conceptualize the need to move addiction treatment from a model of brief biopsychosocial stabilization to a model of sustained recovery management over the long-term stages of recovery, and also to wrap that recovery management treatment model into a larger recovery-oriented system of care, with the system not being treatment institution, but really being the community. So that really broadened us into some other concepts where we began to think about not only treating the individual, but began to treat the community. The community became not first the patient, that we had to build space within recoveries, physical, psychological, cultural space, where recovery could flourish in those communities. We had the image of, imagine a young 18-year-old, their second or third treatment, they've been in treatment for 90 days, severe chronic addiction and related problems. gets discharged, returns to their natural environment. They've been locked up for 90 days. The next morning, they're antsy, they want to walk out the door and get out. Where do they go? And what we said was, if we haven't answered that question, then we haven't developed a system that can support long-term recovery. We also began to look at how long does it take for recovery today to become recovery for a lifetime? Or in other words, when does recovery become stable and sustainable? And to our somewhat surprise, we found through our research studies that for the prospects of future addiction recurrence to drop to the level of about 15%, which would be the general rate of addiction vulnerability in the population, was reached only at the 4 to 5 year window of continuous recovery. And so, in essence, we saw a system that was sort of treating addiction like it was a broken arm. And we began to articulate the need to begin to treat addiction like a chronic disorder. Or put another way, we treat addiction like a bacterial infection, but we only provide a minimum dose of antibiotics, which will temporarily suppress the symptoms of addiction. But as we often know with antibiotics, if you don't take all the antibiotics, they tend to recur in more intractable forms. This was the 1990s that we began to do most of this very rigorous research. In that same period, I sort of went from my clinical role, my research role, my training on the road role around the United States, mostly clinical-oriented training, and began to get a resurgence in my interest in recovery advocacy, really at a public policy level. I remember Bill Moyers interviewing me, I think it was like 1997 for PBS on a series called Close to Home, Moyers on Addiction. And he and I were talking about the cycles that I was describing in the history research that I'd done on the history of treatment and recovery in the United States. And he said, well, if those cycles you describe are true, what could we expect? And I said, well, we've lived through this mass period of re-stigmatization, demedicalization, recriminalization, and the mass incarceration of the 1980s and 1990s. So if history is true to form, we should see a new recovery advocacy movement rising among people and families in recovery to basically rebirth new systems of care and confront some of those kind of conditions. I had no idea at that time that at the time I was saying that in 1997, some of those grassroots recovery community organizations were already being birthed. And in 1998, the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment, recognizing some of those hot spots out there of something very interesting happening, created a program called the Recovery Community Support Program, and they began to provide seed money around the country to create these little grassroots, almost like the early alcoholism councils of the National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence that sprung up in the 40s and 50s and 60s. Almost all recovering people, visionary professionals coming together, really for purposes not of clinical work, but really talking about advocacy. How do we transform the attitudes and policies of the country and create recovery-friendly communities? That work came to be really to transform my life. I got deeply involved in working with recovery community organizations, with the Johnson Institute and William Cope Moyers and Jeff Blodgett and Don Coyas and a whole cadre of other folks. We brought some key recovery leaders from around the country together and planned the 2001 Recovery Summit in St. Paul, Minnesota, which is really the kickoff point of what I've written about as the new recovery advocacy movement in the United States. That movement focused on everything from, basically said, we know a lot about addiction. We could fill whole libraries with what we know about addiction. We could fill whole libraries with what we've learned about this thing we call addiction treatment. But we know very, very little from the standpoint of science and public policy about long-term recovery. And we said it's time to shift the paradigm from a focus on the pathology of addiction or the interventions we use to address that, and really look at the collective experience of people whose lives have been transformed by long-term recovery, and extract lessons out of their lives that can be used to transform addiction treatment in the United States and the broader area of public policy. That 2001 summit was followed by an explosive growth of recovery community organizations around the country that did a number of things. It's things that I never thought I would see in my lifetime. If somebody would have told me at my most depressed moments when I was on those backboards of aging state psychiatric hospitals, Bill, don't despair, because in your lifetime you're going to see grassroots, not only community-based treatment in most communities in the United States. You're going to see recovery community organizations, not recovery mutual aid. We're not talking about AA or NA or Women for Sobriety. We're going to see the growth of those, but we're talking about recovery community, the political and cultural mobilization of people in recovery. And you're going to see in your lifetime, you're going to see a wife of the President of the United States on public television announcing her recovery from addiction to alcohol and other drugs. You're going to be able to walk on streets and see tens of thousands of people, as far as the eyes can see, in recovery, marching publicly. You're going to see AA members and NA members and people on methadone and people out of therapeutic communities and LGBTQ recovery communities marching hand in hand with people in adolescent recovery, and all marching not with those individual identities, but marching together as people in long-term recovery. I would have said that's unthinkable, incomprehensible that I could have seen that in my lifetime. But I lived long enough to see that miracle happen. We developed some concepts about, I think even though we were focused on policy, so much of our early focus was on individuals and how do we begin to expand the continuum of care to support recovery. We then extended that very quickly to embrace families in recovery. And we drew on the work of Stephanie Brown and others, who there's always been this kind of assumption out there that if we get this addicted individual into recovery, the family will restabilize and they'll live happily ever after. When in reality, when Stephanie Brown and other researchers looked at that, she found something radically different than that. What she found was that families are transformed very dysfunctionally around the addiction experience. And that when you suddenly radically alter the dynamics of that family in recovery, she called the early period of recovery for families the trauma of recovery. What a shocking term for us. The trauma of recovery, the exact opposite of what we thought would happen with families. And what she said was, if those families are not provided scaffolding of support in the early years of recovery, families that survived the most devastating effects that addiction had to offer, but survived as a family unit, as sick as they may have been, may actually disintegrate in the early months or years of recovery, and that we need to find ways to support long-term family recovery in the same way. And of course, as the opiate epidemic and the meth epidemics before that began to take steam, and we began to get this dramatic growth in families impacted by the death of a family member, particularly from drug overdoses, the question became, what do we do to support the recovery of families who've been devastated by the loss of individuals? And we're still in the midst of answering that question. But we have found ways to invite families that are infected in that way, to give them a venue to transform grief into advocacy, and to try to take the loss of that family member's life and give it new meaning and hope through their advocacy activities, to look at what are the kind of conditions what are the upstream conditions? Because we're historically we're at the downstream. We're catching people in very late stages of addiction. And what we're trying to do with the advocacy movement and the parents that are involved in that movement is saying, what are the upstream forces that are driving this addiction, the growth in these addiction epidemics, and how do we move farther upstream and deal with those environmental conditions? Not only the personal vulnerabilities, but the environmental conditions related to those. So that kind of growing awareness kind of brought us into Don Coyes, and I do hope you interview Don, and you might invite him to tell the story of the healing forest metaphor. But Don beautifully describes this acute care model by saying what we have traditionally done with a sick and dying tree is we dig the dying tree up and we take it over here into a new piece of land, and we dig a hole and we bury it in this rich soil, and we water it and we fertilize it and we nurture it and we love it and we talk to it, and the plant comes back, renews, and begins to thrive. And we say, what wonderful work we've done. And then we dig the tree up and we come back and replant it in the hole from which it came, and are shocked then that the tree begins to once again wither and die. And Don's metaphor is we need to not only treat the tree, we need to basically treat the forest. We need to treat the soil out of which addiction rises. And so the idea of what is that soil takes us into all kinds of public policy kind of areas. And the idea that not only are there conditions in communities that spawn addiction and create enormous obstacles to recovery, but there are some communities that have been so devastated by addiction and related problems that the whole community has been wounded. And in this way, we talk about the need for maybe a community recovery process that maybe parallels individual recovery, and that maybe people in recovery have a role that they can contribute to the healing of that larger community. Some of us have got, perhaps in our more grandiose moments, even some thoughts that, we feel like that we're in a time where the culture itself is deeply wounded. And our vision is that maybe recovering people have something to offer. We know something about brokenness. We know something about healing. We know something about the steps and processes and stages of healing. And maybe that's something we can offer our communities. When we see communities that are rife with division, we can talk about the power of community. When we see communities, we see communities right now, sort of the emergence of rather distorted characterological values, hubris, narcissism, grandiosity, arrogance. And so we have something to say about the power of humility and the power of openly acknowledging our imperfections, what my mentor Ernie Kurtz called the spirituality of imperfection, and what can arise wondrously out of that brokenness. How people in recovery can not only get well, but get better than well. And communities can not only solve problems, they can get better than well also and really thrive. And then maybe recovering people can play a role in that process. My later years have really been deeply involved in that work. I probably need to also mention probably the other centerpiece of the work that I've done, other than writing about recovery advocacy, peer recovery supports, all the recovery research work that I've been involved in, is really the work on the history of recovery in the United States. That came kind of serendipitously. I was at a flea market in the early 1970s, just wandering around on a Saturday. I walked by a booth, and here is a little pamphlet, aging, yellowed, and I pick it up, and it is an advertisement for an inebriate asylum, and the date on it is 1776. And I went, what? No, excuse me, because the date on it was 1876. And so I said, what? I felt, one, I was just confused, and then I was angry. How could I have already worked in this field for a number of years, thinking we were revolutionizing this whole new thing called addiction treatment, and not be aware that a century earlier, there were these specialized institutions for the treatment of addiction. So I became kind of obsessed with trying to discover what that whole history was. That led to a lifelong mission of reconstructing the history of addiction treatment and recovery in the United States. And I was fortunate through well into that research. I thought I was going to write a little paper, and then the little paper became the book. And then the paper became, as my wife said, the book that has no end to it. What I thought would be a year's project turned into many, many years. In the early 1990s, I was wanting to recruit some help with reviewing the chapters on the history of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I contacted Ernie Kurtz up in Ann Arbor, famous Harvard-trained historian, author of the book Not God, A History of Alcoholics Anonymous, kind of the definitive text on AA. And I said, Ernie, would you be willing to talk to me and review my chapters on AA? And Ernie, gracious as he always was, said sure. And that brief contact led to what would be a sustained mentorship on how to research history, how to write history, and all the collaborations Ernie and I would later do on not only the history of AA and the history of recovery, but kind of the growing, what we called the growing varieties of recovery experience, and trying to map, sort of these multiple pathways and styles and stages of long-term addiction recovery that we did literally right up until the time that he passed from pancreatic cancer. I have vivid recollections at this moment of, we finished reviewing of an article on the growing secular wing within AA on a Thursday, and Ernie passed the following Monday. I mean, he was the courage, the stamina with which he wanted to get that last work done was absolutely stunning, to say the least. Following that work with Ernie, much of what I've tried to do is to not only go back and elaborate on some of the missing chapters in the history of addiction treatment, but also to kind of be the kind of informal historian of the new recovery advocacy movement, interviewing lots of those individuals, sort of engaging them and co-authoring things with me and writing about their sort of local experiences and the lessons they learned. A lot of how-to kind of papers and guidelines on that. And through that course, Ernie, one of the things that he coached me on was, he said he knew I was traveling, 150, 200 days a year, crisscrossing the country, trying to convey all of this sort of new recovery paradigm. And he sort of, like a sponsor, sat me down and said, "You're acting like you're going to live forever, and let's be very clear, you're not." And he said, "You need to begin to capture more and more of what you're doing in writing." And he said, "This is moving so quickly. We're a field that is oral in our orientation. Very few of us write. There aren't memoirs of people. And we need to find a way to capture this history, because some of what's here could get lost, and some things of great value could get lost. And people in the future are going to need to know what some of those things are that we and you learned." And so that was a period where I shifted much of my work from the spoken word of traveling and speaking and lecturing and doing workshops to trying to do as much as I could to get things down in writing. And Ernie said, Ernie was much more tech savvy than I did, and he said, "And what you need to do before you die is you need to leave all the collected works you've done, all the interviews you've done with all the leaders in the field who won't write memoirs, who don't publish in traditional journals, but you need to interview them and get that history captured. And by the way," he said, "and you need to do it on a website." So Ernie was the challenge to me to create what became WilliamWhitePapers.com, which is virtually not just literally almost everything I've written, covering the more than 20 books, monographs, papers, but also a collection of other resources that are outside the public domain, the published domain, and also include things that civilians, mainstream people have difficulty getting to because they've been sort of imprisoned inside the professional journal world. So I would take some of those key findings, translate them into English that real people can read and understand, and then capture them and get them on the website. So I think if there's a contribution that I've left to the field, it's probably going to be in those collected writings. And in the last years, I've often had a sense that I'm writing for the present, but in a real sense, I'm really writing for people who will be reading this when I'm not here. And I've encouraged other people from this period who are sort of some of the elders of our field to do some of that same work. To give you an example of the power of history, is not history because it's interesting. It's really history with an agenda. And the agenda is, what are the lessons buried in that history that have profound relevance to us today? For example, we act as if the addiction treatment field will live forever now that it's been created. I don't believe that. I believe addiction treatment as a social institution is still very much on probationary status right now in this culture. I believe there have been excesses within the industry that could create a cultural backlash that could very much jeopardize a lot of what we've spent decades creating. So how do I know that? If I go back and look at the history of the inebriate asylums, the inebriate homes, the private addiction cure institutes of the 19th century, if I look at the miracle cures, bottled and boxed cures for addiction and all the frauds that went with them, and say, how did we go from this flourishing network of services that flourished in the 1870s through the turn of the century, and that 15 years later, the vast majority of those would have collapsed and died? Well, there's some things we can learn from them. One was they had a very poor scientific foundation. When people asked for the evidence of their effectiveness over time, they simply didn't have it. It didn't take long for when the excessive marketing of we guarantee cures, people talked about 100% cures of those they were treating. It didn't take long before everyone knew someone for whom addiction treatment had not worked. If we jump to the modern era with our slogan, treatment works, widely promoted as the dominant slogan promoting addiction treatment as a service, how long do you think it's taken for everyone to now know someone for whom treatment has not worked, and for whom multiple treatments have not worked, and for whom multiple treatments were followed by the death of that individual from active addiction? So you begin to then get a backlash by over-promoting what a single episode or even multiple episodes of addiction treatment can do. There were ethical abuses within the industry then, financial exploitation of patients and their families, sexual exploitation, physical abuses of patients during that time period that created a backlash. A number of other factors, but I think one of the critical factors was in some ways that first generation of programs. You could say the field died of old age in some ways. You had a group of charismatic, brilliant pioneers who founded those treatment institutions, celebrated the idea of inebriety as a disease. It is a treatable disease, and created the institutions to do that. Did that, ran those institutions and led that field. And the professional associations related to that field. The Journal of Inebriety, the first addiction professional science-based journal of that period, and did that for a number of years. And then when we hit the turn of the century, we had a period where there was kind of growing pessimism about the prospects of treatment and recovery. And so what this culture, the United States, did was said, maybe we should just let the existing alcoholics and addicts die off and prevent a new generation of alcoholics and addicts by legally prohibiting the sale of alcohol and aggressively controlling the distribution of opium, morphine, cocaine, and other psychoactive substances. And that's what they did. Within 15 years, we got the beginning of drug prohibition and alcohol prohibition in the United States. And in the wake of those radical changes, most of the treatment network collapsed. There would be pockets that would continue, but those pockets it's going to take through the early 20s, all the way into the advocacy movement in the 40s, all the way to the 70s to rebirth addiction treatment. The point being, if addiction treatment today were to collapse, we could go back and draw on the lessons of one, how long did it take to rebirth that system of care? And how did it occur? And so people say, well, aren't you afraid? Aren't you pessimistic about those prospects when you see some of those cultural shifts going on? And I'm actually very hopeful, because what I know is if addiction treatment died today, if every addiction treatment program in the United States closed today, what I know beyond a shadow of a doubt is people in recovery and their families will rise up tomorrow and rebirth new systems of support and care. and maybe in better design than the ones that preceded it. So I bring enormous optimism, coming primarily from the affected community. We've developed our treatment models on the most severe and complex and latest stages of addiction. And we have, by the way, very little clinical knowledge of what people look like who are at the earliest and moderate stages of that. And some of our models for severity and complexity may not work at all for people in early and middle stages of recovery. So we need that. We also need a different kind of model of, because we've generally thought pain will bring people to us, the bottom experience. But we also need to understand there's a world of people out there for which there is no amount of pain that will bring them into a recovery process. I can remember vividly outreach workers telling me that we're African-American community in Chicago, and an outreach worker telling me, working with this unique project, she said, "Bill, you don't get it. My clients don't hit bottom. My clients live on the bottom. The issue is not an absence of pain. The issue is an absence of hope." So it's not pain. Pain will not bring that woman to recovery. What will bring her to recovery is some issue of hope. And that hope is probably going to come from another recovery woman who shares her history and shares her culture.